Thanks everybody for coming to join us today. This is a discussion about intersection between climate change and data journalism and data science that started a couple years ago through an initiative called UK Underwater that was a day and a half event that we put together to talk about the plights of climate change, but specifically flooding and the inequalities associated with that and how data science could help us understand communication around not just flooding, but larger issues. And along with Julia Pinto, who's here, who is at Penn State in the US, we put together a double special issue of Journalism Practice, which is a Q1 journal published by Routledge, Taylor, and Francis. And the guest joining us today might have also been appearing on the most recent episode of The J Word, which is a podcast that we do related to that journal that makes articles free access temporarily if they're not open access already. And we have another podcast based upon the articles that they wrote for the special issue from another group appearing in a couple weeks' time. So I'll put some of that information into the chat as we get going. But really, really grateful for everybody joining today. And we're going to start with Nadine Strauss, who has, with her team, done some really interesting work looking at how journalists have talked about heat. And I think that's, if you can also access the free version of the introduction that Juliet and I wrote for the special issue, we're talking about issues of heat as an example of some of the synergistic effects of climate change, but also how journalists have to adapt to multiple influences of climate change that they have to cover. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in this special issue that we hope is really helpful. And I think, Nadine, you could help kind of get us started by connecting your paper as you'll do, but also maybe to give us kind of a sense of what journalism is facing and how it's operating dealing with climate change before we start going into more of the specifics of some of the intersections between data science and technologies in covering these issues. Does that sound okay?
Yes, perfect. I will start sharing my screen. Just a moment. We have tried it before, so it should work now. Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you very much for being part of this special issue. My team, together with James Painter, Joshua Ettinger, Marie-Noëlle Dutroux, Anke Wonnenberger, and Peter Walton, we had the opportunity to really work on this exciting project, which was about the reporting on the 2019 European heat waves and climate change. We wanted to know with this research how journalists feel about reporting about heat waves, what motivations they have, but also what kind of role perceptions they ascribe with. So as I said, it's not it's a collaborative work, and today on behalf of my team I will present you some of the findings that you can of course also find in the paper. So to start with, of course, we all see that extreme weather events have become more severe and more likely due to climate change. Just to look back on 2021, we saw that there were forest fires in Greece, in the Mediterranean area. We saw the earthquake and hurricane in Haiti. But even here in Germany, where I'm from, we also saw unprecedented floods. And again, also this year, there were floods in Australia that we have all seen across the news. And what has been said already in introduction now, we see that also the impacts of these extreme weather events are unequally spread across the society. And we also see that the younger, older people who have a precondition are more affected by the effects of these extreme weather events. In correspondence to the extreme weather events, we also see in the past years that there's new science emerging on kind of finding out to what extent these extreme weather events are caused or are cause of climate change. These studies are called event attribution studies, and they use the newest models and the newest climate data to say how much more likely and how much more intense a certain weather event has become due to climate change. And what you see here on the left side is a map based on carbon breath. And we see here that across the world, there have already been 350 peer-reviewed studies studying the event attribution of extreme weather events. And two major scientists behind these event attribution studies are Friederike Otto, who has previously worked in Oxford, is now at the Imperial College in the UK, and Geert Jan van Oldenburg, who unfortunately died last week. They were actually named as two of the most influential people in 2021, which shows the impact and also the meaning of these event attribution studies for science. So, of course, these new science that has emerged also poses a new challenge and becomes paramount for climate journalism to report on. We know from previous research, from the Digital News Report, for example, that is released on a yearly basis, that the news media still remained one of the widely used information source for climate change information. However, previous research has also shown that mainstream and legacy media do not sufficiently link these extreme weather events with climate change, and particularly in those countries where also climate change deniers are more pronounced, such as in the UK, Australia, and in the USA. However, other research has also shown that there are some news outlets that are actually talking about this link, but those are mostly elite news, but also climate specialist news. And when this is done, they are not really relying on the exact phrasing of the event attribution studies, but rather use generic phrases. And overall, little attention has been paid previously in research to the coverage and the dealing by journalists with extreme weather events and these attribution studies. So as already in introduction, we have also heard that journalism faces challenges, and this is also true, of course, for climate journalism, and especially when they are also covering these extreme weather events. First of all, there's a lack of time and resources. Generally, we have more generalist reporters who have to cover many different topics and not just one beat. Sometimes we also see that the access to sources become more and more difficult. And then on top of that, with the event attribution studies, we also see that it's kind of a complicated science. And of course, not every journalist has a training on interpreting this science in easy and lay terms. And what has been also criticized by researchers is that usually the wrong questions are asked about these extreme weather events. Usually it's the question of, is it caused by climate change? But this is, according to scientists, wrong. Rather, we should ask how much more likely and how much more severe has an extreme weather event become due to climate change. Also, we see from a literature review and from research on climate journalism that climate journalism has changed from a gatekeeping to a curating role, but that they still rather consider themselves as neutral informers, translators, and explainers. But more recently, we also see the move that some journalists feel this role of an advocate more pronounced. In my own research that I did myself on financial journalism, I also see that many of these journalists actually also ascribe themselves this kind of advocacy role and fighting for a more equal and sustainable financial system. But I also have to kind of not be too critical, because we actually do see a lot of new developments in the past 2 years in journalism. There are more environmental beats. We have seen that, for example, The Guardian has announced climate emergency. We see very classical conservative newspapers like the NZZ in Switzerland or the FAZ in Germany that have a particular page just to cover on climate change. And we also see more positive and solution-based coverage. So there are some movements. Nevertheless, for our study, the 2019 heatwave was specifically interesting. Why is that? Because at that point in the summer month, there were 2 studies actually released on this new science. One was about France, which showed that the heatwave there was made 100 times more likely and severe. And the other one was about Western Europe, covering the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands, and showing that in those 2 countries, the UK and Germany, those heat waves were also made more likely and more severe by 10 times. Also, other research has shown that these heat waves were very impactful because we saw that it was one of the deadliest event in 2019, with 2,500 deaths in Belgium, the Netherlands, UK, and France together. So it is a really impactful event that needs to be studied. So our research questions we then posed were, to what extent were journalists aware of EEA studies, and how did they report about them in relation to the 2019 European heat waves and heat waves in general? Second, what common practices did journalists follow in reporting about the 2019 European heat waves, including their use of different sources? And third, what role perceptions do journalists follow when reporting about extreme weather events? And to what extent do journalists cite organizational and contextual factors as influences upon their reporting about the 2019 European heat waves? How did we go about that? We had a first study that we did on the content analysis of the 2019 heat wave, where we studied how the journalists actually reported about it. For that, we selected the countries that were most affected by the heat wave: France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the UK. We then looked at which one were the 5 most visited online news per country, and we then scraped all articles that dealt with the heat wave, but particularly looked at the ones that were mentioning a link to climate change. And so based on these 267 articles, we then identified the journalists that were reporting here. Overall, then, we had around 240 journalists that we contacted for our survey. And in the end, we had 42 respondents. The survey was a quick turnaround. It took place in February last year, so just about a year ago, and it was 10 minutes in total to complete. So what are the results? You can, of course, also read them in our special issue, but here a short glimpse of what we found. First of all, we had kind of an equal spread of journalists in all 4 countries. They were from a variety of news outlets. You can see them here on the right side. Their age was also varied between 25 and 45 years old. Many had more than 10 years of experience, but we had more males in our sample, we have to say. Also, there was a slight overrepresentation of journalists working for leftist news outlets. Regarding their role descriptions, we had rather few who were actually specifically responsible for science and environmental reporting, and rather generalist reporters, also confirming previous studies. Regarding the knowledge about these extreme weather events and the studies for the heatwave in 2019, the journalists said that they found out about it via press releases, news agencies, or their colleagues. Furthermore, we also saw that there was rather little to moderate knowledge about these EEA studies. However, writing about climate change overall was considered more and more important. When we look more into the countries themselves and the differences there, we found that journalists in the UK were most aware of these studies, and the Netherlands the least. However, France, for example, had the highest knowledge about these studies, probably also because one of the studies specifically dealt with the country. What was interesting, though, is that 64% of the journalists surveyed said that it's also important, or somewhat important, to highlight the uncertainty related to the studies. And also, a lot of the journalists said that it's very important also to offer solutions for climate change. So we see this solution-based journalism also resonated here in these results. Interestingly, what we have actually heard from previous studies, most of our journalists in our survey said that they do not deal with limited time or limited resources, specifically also when they were writing about the heat wave. So this is also a bit optimistic for the field. Overall, when we wanted to know a little bit more in depth how they reported about these studies, 77% across the 4 countries indicated that it's very and extremely important to highlight that climate change had made the heat waves more likely and more severe. So this was interesting because this is exactly the phrase that we were looking at based on the event attribution studies. And we see that quite a majority actually was in favor of using this phrase. The most sources, another field of research that we know from previous research, was interesting. because here, when we asked them what kind of sources they use for writing about the heat wave, we saw that they used mostly meteorologists, authors of a scientific report, or press agency statements. So we do see that there's quite very specific a choice of sources, and that they also rely a lot on the scientific insights here. On the other hand, what is a little bit sobering is that still most of the journalists said that the most important thing to report about the heat wave are the record-breaking temperatures and how it impacts everyday life. And only on the third spot, we do see that the journalists said that scientific reports or quotes from scientists are also important to include in this kind of coverage. We, of course, also were interested in the role perceptions. And here we also see quite a resonating picture from previous studies where the educating role or the educator role was most pronounced, and followed by neutral and impartial observer. And at last, we see the advocate. But nevertheless, we have to say that on a scale from 1 to 5, 2.4 is not too bad. So we do see that this role is getting much more attention probably these days. So to sum up the findings, we do see that actually also when we look back to the past year, what I showed in the introduction, and all these kind of extreme weather events, the fires, the floods, hurricanes, we do see that journalists across Europe are more and more likely to actually report on the science behind it. So there is a movement, and we also saw it with the new IPCC report that the science behind these weather events gets more and more reporting. So this was, from my side, a short intro and overview of our study. I hope you will read it up on the special issue, and thank you for your attention.
Well, thanks so much for that. It's a good overview, even if just from Europe, but certainly a very diverse and inclusive geographic perspective of Europe. So that's really, really helpful. One of the next talks, and we'll take questions at the end just to kind of keep things in order. That's really helpful to give us the overview, because the next step is talking to Lawrence here, who is going to show through how science and data can be expressed through the journalism, and particularly in new interactive and immersive forms of journalism. So while the Data Science Institute is certainly focused on the understanding of the numbers and the capturing of the data and the expression of it, it's the journalist's role to find a way to make that a story and make that immersive. And so, Lawrence, I'm going to turn this over to you, and maybe you can talk to us a little bit about this really exciting iDoc genre and give us an idea of how data science and climate change journalism is being expressed through immersion.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to try and share my screen as well. I think obviously just got to get to the right place. But yeah, thanks very much for having me. Yeah, so this study that I'm doing part of my PhD is it is about I need to share my screen as well. Reminds me of teaching. There we go. Okay, yeah. So this study is about again how we can understand different forms of journalism and how it can be used to help communicate climate change sort of concepts, to sort of define what we were talking about in terms of climate change. We looked at a concept of climate change literacy, and what we wanted to do was do a different type of content analysis where we looked at the potential of interactivity and gamification within interactive documentaries, which are also called iDocs, and they've got lots of other names like web docs, and they can be combined within immersive journalism. And how can that help either increase engagement with an audience, or try and inoculate audiences against techniques of misinformation. And obviously, my name's Lawrence Brannan, and my co-authors are Lisa Gold, Johnny McGee, and Jeff Walton. So just as a starting point, I think lots of people are very passionate about sort of interactivity and conveying journalistic stories in different ways. But also, I think it's a really challenging time for interactive journalism, whether it's conveying news through social media, or whether it's creating a completely authored interactive documentary. And some of the reasons for that is that, you know, the battle for people's attention is getting increasingly fierce, and engaging new audiences with your interactive product is not always guaranteed. And there's quite a few studies that have also been done that actually audiences like increasing interactivity? Do they like consuming their news through audio and video or interactive formats? And quite often, sometimes people want quick and easy news in a really simple format, and maybe interactivity does not always result in an engaged and a well-informed audience. So there's a clear problem, and this quotation I think was really helpful in sort of posing that problem as a starting point for this study, in that, you know, even though there's overwhelming scientific agreement on climate change and the increased extreme weather events, in order to actually put into action any sort of policy to do anything about it, means that we need to be able to convince you know, populations of this overwhelming scientific agreement. And it's much more challenging than is earlier thought, in that, you know, there's so many different types of misinformation and disinformation by various actors, which means that journalists need to understand new frameworks. So this quote says, "We require frameworks that provide a comprehensive understanding of new techniques to neutralize misinformation content." And some of the techniques that we looked at that came through the sort of literature and the outcomes of the study were things like a theory called inoculation technique, and also the gamification of news, which is sort of explains some of the images on this slide. You know, can we use those techniques to help neutralize misinformation and disinformation, which hopefully would allow journalists to achieve their aim of informing the public? So just looking at some of the literature that we started off with, and obviously there's so much more in the paper as well, is that one of the challenges for journalists is that in a multi-choice media environment, it's really difficult to get people to access as much information. And so we need creative ways and easy ways, according to the study here, to actually encourage journalists and encourage audiences to engage with that content. Because you can make something that you're really proud of as a piece of journalism, and it's always sort of disheartening when not the amount of people who interact with it is not as successful as you would hope it to be. And so one solution to that is that iDocs do represent a really compelling story form where you can do a lot of the things that you need to do, because you can highlight alternative views, you can engage the users in multiple narratives, and you can create complex information and present complex information using lots of different media formats. So there's lots of potential positives for this format, but again, another challenge is that, you know, when you're combating or trying to present information that is being distorted by multiple sort of misinformation strategies, like other actors who cherry pick information, or they distort data, or they present fake news, and there's obviously lots of polarization in the discourse about this topic as well. How do journalists overcome that? And the inoculation theory is sort of based on the fact that if you actually expose audiences or groups of people to weaker forms of disinformation, and you get them to interact with it and say, this is something you might come across in your daily lives, here's why it is misinformation and what can you look out for to identify it. If you can do that to audiences, they're much less likely to accept it when they do see it in the media or on social media. So things like inoculation theory is a one way of actually reducing the impact of disinformation. So what did we do? We used this framework for sort of immersion journalism, and we also used climate literacy, the concept of climate literacy, and we said, what different types of immersive journalism can we explore to try and help us understand different ways of promoting, journalistic stories that will help the audiences get the information they need. And so we came up with 3 research questions, which were what features of IDOC structures can we identify and how do they affect journalistic expressions of environmental issues? What characteristics have the potential to effectively communicate climate journalism or combat climate disinformation? And how do IDOCs and gamification concepts sort of interrelate, and how can they inform future work and scholarly activity? And how did we do that? Well, we did a content analysis, but it wasn't a large sample content analysis of looking for the a particular element of a particular type of journalism. What we decided to do was do a small scale content analysis of 3 distinct examples of interactive journalism. So we actively looked for 3 examples of interactive journalism which used different techniques. And so we could actually identify the differences between them and compare which one was potentially more like legacy media and which one was potentially had more elements of gamification and different structures and so on. So we identified Climate Change Melting Ice, which was a 360-degree video report. The Last Generation is more like traditional or long-form journalism or slow-form journalism. And then Offshore is much more like it's got much more elements of documentary video games. And we came up with a coding scheme where we identified the different elements of the interactive journalism, and then we, because we coded it, we could then clearly compare them compare their networks. And so we found out that these are the sort of the network structures or the maps of the various different interactive documentaries we looked at. One's about an offshore oil rig. One's about the impact of climate change on the Marshall Islands, where they're quite afraid of rising sea levels. And one is about the melting ice caps. And you can see there that the structures are completely different, and you've got the nodes where you might interact with some media, and then you've obviously got the links between them where you can sort of move from one element of the documentary to another. And you can see that some of them are completely sort of multi-stranded, some are more like a sort of complete maze and a network. And one of them, which is this is Climate Change Melting Ice, is much more linear. So you've got different types of interactive journalism there. And how did this help us understand the different types? Is that, you know, what this shows is you can code and identify the different types of immersive journalism, but also by coding them, you can actually spot elements of gamification. So something that's very linear and doesn't have like a hidden story, or it doesn't have it doesn't have any sort of jeopardy, and you're not sort of challenged to get through the story at all. It's very passive and you just watch it. That can obviously sort of lead to more sort of old-fashioned ways of interacting with the media, where you're passive. And I really like this quote here. Well, it's not a quote actually, but I really like this concept here of lean back participants who they're not really engaged with the story world. They're just letting it flow over them. Whereas what some journalists would like to encourage is more engagement in the topic. So you can actually seek out information. You pose the participants a challenge to try and make sure that they get the information that you need. And so we did find that there were lots of different structures, as we've seen in the previous slide. And you compare this to the literature, and scholars and sort of practitioners have been coming up with these networks. And I think it really helps us understand how you can tell a story using interactive media. And so, just to sort of summarize, we sort of suggest that, if you add gamification to iDocumentary projects, and if you embedded inoculation techniques, it does have the potential to engage audiences, and actually you could potentially combat misinformation by using those techniques, but you really have to plan it in from an earlier stage. And as the previous speaker was just saying, is that journalists may not always have the training or the time to do that. And hopefully this will inform sort of my future research, in that what we'd like to do is we'd like to try and establish a correlation between if we did create an iDoc, one of which didn't have a gamification approach, and the same documentary also had a gamification approach. If we test that on obviously an audience, can we get data so we can actually establish a correlation between, if one does have gamification, will it engage the audience? And obviously, if we can engage the audience to a greater degree, will that have positive benefits for journalists? And I think that is me done. Thank you very much, everyone. I don't know if anyone's got any questions, or you can save them to the end, Ted. It's I don't know how you're managing it.
Well, I mean, I think, we could take a couple of questions now for our first two speakers if we have them. Questions from guests or from other speakers before we go into the next two. That might make some sense. So are there any questions or comments that people are wanting to say or think about before we forget them? Go ahead and just unmute and
I think.
Go ahead, Lawrence.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I was just spotting from Nadine's presentation is that quite early on one of her slides, it was, do the journalists have the time and the training, and with obviously the pressures to go out and do other stories, quite often news organizations will have a data journalism team, but are they investing the resources or to actually maybe present that data in a way that has a narrative? And I just think there's some quite similarities, because some of these interactive documentaries that I've been studying, they must take a massive team and a huge amount of effort to present all these complex. And I was just wondering if Nadine thought that with her work that comes through with journalists that she interacts with as well.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Actually, we had also in our survey a field for remarks, and we came across quite often the kind of note that they made that some journalists only covered the heat wave based on a press release, and just as a kind of, they got the information, they just rewrote a little bit. And then there were some people who actually did this kind of data-driven journalism stories, and they were actually, there was one person who was really working in that field and said he was having a long-term project on this kind of issues. And I remember this article also quoting it for the German area, where they did really nice visuals for climate and how it changed over time, and how cities and the whole world were affected. So I do see that there's a difference, and but at the same time, I think it's great also that news outlets are investing more resources in this kind of journalism and providing more insights by data and doing these kind of visual analysis. And your work is great. I think it's really fascinating to also see how these stories evolve, and it goes back to also this kind of storytelling techniques and how to actually get people immersed in a story. Can you say maybe something also about, from your feeling, which of the types of gamification would be most effective for the audience?
Yeah, I think with with audiences wanting to get their news stories as quickly and as and in small sections as possible, I think that there needs to be some sort of work done or into how can you have a story which is really accessible to get into. So like you enter your postcode for argument's sake, and it will tell you about what's happening in your area, and these things happen already in terms of crime and climate change and so on. And once you've hooked them in with something that's really accessible and not challenging, then if you started to send them small elements of a game that would engage them on a regular basis. I mean, I'm playing Wordle at the moment, and one of the things that's really great about it, and it comes from a news organization, is that it's because it's so easy and bite-sized. You can just do it every day, and it's addictive. And I'm sure you probably play it as well. And I just think if there was a way of doing news and documentary content that had that sort of daily bite-size drip feed approach, I think that would be really, really, really interesting. Sadly, that's not what I'm planning to do in the rest of my PhD, but maybe I think that would really work.
Nadine, I've got a question for you, if that's all right. You said the most common themes of European news coverage of the heat wave were looking at the temperatures and how it affected regular people. Can you tell me, what did that coverage look like? When you say how it affected regular people, what themes did they emphasize? How did they cover those effects on a routine basis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. So remembering back what we coded also for the articles, it was mostly how to deal with the heat, like in a sense that that there was a lot of coverage how infrastructure was also affected. For example, in the Netherlands, there were issues with the streets that had issues because of the heat. In France, I think there were also some, the trains could not go, so they had to stop the trains. In Germany, there were the danger of forest fires. So it was more about these linkages of how it affects our daily environment and life, but not so much actually about how it affects the person itself, for example, in terms of health. There were some studies that also talked about, for example, how to deal with heat, to drink water, to stay inside, and all these kind of lists of things that you should do. But it was not really making people aware that this is actually dangerous, and kind of stressing also that this has something to do with climate change and we should worry about. But rather, how should I deal with it on my daily day or on a regular day? Like a how-to basically guideline.
So less coverage on sort of disaster, so to speak. And
Yeah.
Part of that might be the difference between American and European media. Part of that might be that heat waves are such a slow-moving disaster, unlike a hurricane or something like that. But I think when we have severe weather in this country, it's very often disaster and emotion centric. And you see the role of the flooding survivors wading through the floods or something like that. And so I'm wondering, but it is in some ways an apples and oranges comparison, because that heat wave went on for a while and hurricanes usually don't.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, we had a follow-up study now just finished about the imagery of the heat wave coverage, which was very interesting because we also saw this kind of difference between talking about the severity of the heat wave, but then picturing it with people jumping into the swimming pool, having fun at the beach, and enjoying the water in water fountains. So there's this discrepancy also how you communicate it. And as you say, this cultural and geographical differences in that sense, because of course we as Western Europeans, Northern Europeans, we are actually very happy when there is warm weather and when there's the sun out. And so in that sense, it's kind of very tricky to also explain the science and the danger of climate change behind it.
Yeah.
One more question before we go to this great conversation. Hate to interrupt it. I think it's really, really interesting. And Nidhi, do you want to put that link to that other article maybe into the chat?
It's just submitted. No, we just submitted it.
6 months we'll have that to read. We have a couple quick questions here. One from Mimi, who's asking for Lawrence. When you're doing the gaming paper, where do you look for the literature to back up your work, since it's really a newer area? So where is it that you go to kind of understand what's been done, what people are talking about in terms of theory, and maybe some of the practices for putting that work together?
Yeah, I think gamification is, because it's really relatively new, but it's also quite broad so you can look at the education sphere in terms of gamification in the classroom, as it were, or using traditional cardboard and dice board games to educate people of all ages. And I think that's one really good area for to exploit in terms of the literature review. There's some amazing board games that can be used to educate people about scientific concepts. There's one particularly, it's the Iberian edition of Pandemic, which is all about different actual sort of diseases which were on that continent in a historical time period. And then if you look at more into the sort of digital sphere, obviously there's, well, not obviously, but there's a lot of sort of documentary video games that and actually I think there's an argument where you can use traditional video games or common mainstream video games to educate users about history, Call of Duty and exploring the 3D worlds on Assassin's Creed and so on. And I just saw in the chat there's the gamification of journalism book as well, which is fantastic. And then finally, it's the sort of the data journalism and news games as well, where I think it's more of a data journalism. But so I think there's 3 potential areas you could go to. I mean, I'm sure there's more as well. But I think that's where I've started off, and I think just the gamification of board games and education through games is that's a really, really good starting point.
And I just spoke about some of this to a group of students in Lithuania yesterday about gamification in journalism, and came across a paper, a paper version of gamification of news from 1886 in Nellie Bly's World Travels. And so there's an actual board game that the newspaper put out, I think it was The World, put out, so you could actually follow along and play a game about Nellie Bly's travels. And so games have been around for a long time, but I think that there's a really interesting thing there. And I do want to get this one question before we go to Matthias Philippe. This is from Elizabeth, who says, and I think we still have 2 people to go, so I think there may be a way to answer this also at the end as that comes up. Have any of the panel looked into demographic differences in communicating data and climate change science? I'd be interested to find out if different demographics have different information requirements or attitudes toward interactivity. Do we want to try and address that now, or do you think we should, since we'll be going to Latin America and then to the southern part of the US, do you think we should maybe go there first? Because I think some of that stuff will be coming out. I don't know if Elizabeth thinks that's cheating in getting to the answer, but I think we might be able to get there a little bit more, since we're now going to go to Matthias Philippe. Is that okay? I hope. So let's keep that in mind. That's a good question. Let's keep that in mind as we go into the next couple papers. So Matthias Philippe de Lima Santos in Brazil did a really great piece about collaboration in journalism and fact-checking in data journalism, and kind of the challenges and opportunities that exist around that, specific to climate change. And so maybe we can take Elizabeth's question in mind as we think through this presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you for having me here. So let me share my presentation. So here, maybe you can see it. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it. Yep.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so thank you for having me here, especially Robert and Julie, who organized this amazing special issue. As Robert was saying, this paper that I'm presenting here today, it's about Latin America, especially Argentina. That it's part of this study was part of a secondment that I had while I was working in the JOES project. And so I went to La Nación and stayed there, like doing participant observations for 3 months. And one of the studies that came out of that is this one. So setting an agenda to tackle the environmental issues with data in collaboration is part of these lessons that I learned from La Nación, that they built this project that is about environmental data journalism. So what is environmental data journalism? It's bring the combination of data journalism and environmental journalism. So these two terms are somehow very different, but they bring together one very important thing that is collaboration, and I'm going to describe this later. So having this spoiler said, going back, so data journalism, it's about these principles of journalism with precision of data science, and has this idea of renew the promises of the objectivity or move away from that traditional he said, she said reporting and let the data speak by itself and try to exclude opinions and the minimal personalization. Mainly in the global south, we have this perception that is about reporting to foreign governments about issues in the global south. And then it's not really about the issues, but about agents of Western influence trying to influence, to have some, influence in the country, decide about the future of the country. So that's the perception. So there is this allegation of subjectivity for the public, by the public, and this dichotomy between a balanced journalism versus advocacy journalism is also perceived by the public. So it's really hard to have this role in advocating for nature and science rather than producing this objective journalism and in the perception. So having said that, I think what environmental data journalism brings together is the collaboration, because when we have environmental data journalism, we are collaborating with NGOs, with researchers, and the same with data journalism. So to explain a little bit about how this term environmental data journalism was emerged in this newsroom, because La Nación Data is a team that has a long history, like producing data stories, and it's well recognized not only in the newsroom, but outside the newsroom, the data team. They receive a lot of awards. So it's a long-term strategy of La Nación. So they decide to have a team, and it's not a really small team. When I was there, was around 10 people working with different backgrounds.
Second, I'm sorry, can I interrupt for a second? I don't know. My Teams is acting kind of strange. I'm sorry. I don't know.
Same here, Ted. Same here.
Oh, okay. I don't know if we're seeing your presentation. If you wanted to try and share again, maybe.
It keeps dropping out. And I think we just lost somebody who's rejoined the meeting. So I think there was a Teams glitch or something.
Yeah. It was.
Can you see the presentation?
Yes, now we can. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry.
No.
So yeah. But are you listening to me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So yeah. So this is a long-term strategy, and then they decide to move not only to report in data journalism in general and try to specialize in this environmental reporting. So first, they, as we are mentioning here in the previous presentation, is something that journalists in general, they are not very specialized, or they don't have time to specialize. So first, they try to collaborate with other teams in the newsroom, other desk, and to have the ideas behind that. So they identify the events and dates that would be important to build some data stories. And then they create three axes, that is climate change, biodiversity, and participation. Because for La Nación, it's very important to have the public involved in their data stories. So they, in the past, they were really known because of their crowdsourcing capability of bringing the people to help them in analyzing the data and understand what is behind the data. So they try to build their environmental data journalism in these three axes. And when I'm talking about participation, for example, when was summer there, they organized like a beach cleanup. they tried also to use like this Instagram stories filters to, create some movements that attract people to use and some producing the traditional data stories. So they are trying to bring engage with the public in different ways. And this was important because they try to foster the active collaboration at different levels. And I'm going to explain later how this was made to La Nación to produce this data, environmental data stories. And another thing that's very important is like La Nación Naturaleza, that is this nature brand that they created to focus on environmental data reporting. It's a cross-sectional editorial brand. So they don't have like, for example, a specific team to dedicate on that. So it's a data team working with different news desks. So having said that, the level of collaboration is very important, and they understand that this is not only inside the newsroom, but outside the newsroom. From the internal side, they try to collaborate with, as I mentioned, with the other desks, but it's also because the data team is established as separate from the visualization team. So there is one part that is responsible to analyze the data, to create the stories, and the other ones to produce this visualization. So they have this collaboration that is something that was since the beginning. And when they moved to this environmental reporting, they try to bring that with the other news desk. And also the idea is not only the team to bring ideas to the other teams, but also the other teams come to them and pitch ideas of what we can produce about data stories. So do you have like a data set about a certain topic, and then the team try to investigate it and find if it's possible? At the external level, they have different levels of collaboration. And as there is a topic, this is a topic that as they don't have a lot of specialization, so they need to work with actors that have better understanding of that. So they invite them to the newsroom. This was before the pandemic, right? So they invited them to the newsroom. So they have like a meeting and then try to understand how they can collaborate with each other. Invite them also to have this half data day for the environmental for environmental topics, and then they discuss about, for example, was about solar farms, the one that I participate. So they are discussing about new kinds of energy sources that was being implemented in Argentina. So they brought these people that were involved in these projects to explain how they could, like investigate more about that. What are the things that were behind? And this collaboration is also it also happens when they are trying to get some knowledge that they don't have in the newsroom. For example, when they did an investigation about the solar farms, the growing of solar farms in Argentina, and to see if it was planned as the government said, they work with a startup, and they have this kind of memorandum of understanding where they divide the responsibilities and establish that the final objective was to produce a news story, a data-driven news story. And they are not like having any kind of financial involvement in these circumstances. So that's like the different types of collaboration that they bring. And this is important to somehow cover this gap of knowledge that they might have about environmental topics. So based on that, the newsroom built this agenda and tried to produce that and collaborate collaborate not only with external actors, but also bring the people to this to promote these stories and events that they are created. So that's more or less what I have to say about this study. Of course, there is much more that can be read in the paper. I hope you can enjoy that, and thank you.
Well, I think that does get to some of the questions of some of the cultural differences and how journalists may or may not operate in how to gather information and put it together. And I think that's a nice segue into our last paper before we hear some closing comments from Juliet and take some final questions. But because we're moving now into Marcus Funk's paper, where that same sort of newsroom environment and notions of collaboration, but also messaging and how we relay things such as forecasts and journalistic speculation and data fact-checking and corrections, all of those different things kind of come into play. And I think that really wraps up, before we get to Juliet, some of the different cultural differences and how journalism can work. So without giving away the entire paper, Marcus, I'll turn this over to you now.
No, you're welcome. Keep going. That's fine. So I'm Marcus Funk. I'm really excited to be here. Thank y'all. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I do have a website to show everybody. So that works. In 2017, in August and very early September, Hurricane Harvey hit the Houston area. It was a record-breaking storm in a lot of different ways. It remains the rainiest rainfall event in American history, and that includes Hawaii. And it is, depending on your metric, depending on your rubrics, the second most expensive natural disaster in American history. Conventional local media coverage of severe weather, including hurricanes, typically is very, like we were discussing earlier, very disaster centric, very emotional. A lot of coverage of flooded homes and survivors wading through floodwaters, or pictures of the freeways that are filled to the brim with floodwater and semi trucks stuck, that sort of thing. A lot of interviews with flooding survivors, a lot of focus on damage and loss, both literal and figurative, in terms of emotional damages, a lot of people crying, in terms of loss of life, in terms of property damage, financial damage, that sort of thing. During Harvey, that was wall to wall on all the local TV stations. It felt very much like a cable news event, but it was playing in everybody's living room on a local level through the terrestrial airwaves. That didn't work for me. I was here for Harvey. It was really stressful. And I found that just sitting there watching that wall-to-wall coverage wasn't helping. It didn't make me feel more informed, and it didn't make me feel any better. And so what I found, and what a lot of Texans found, was a local independent weather blog called Space City Weather that at the time before the storm was generally a quote unquote leisure time hobby. It was run by some professional meteorologists who had worked in local journalism before, but were no longer working in local journalism. The fellow who started it had been working, blogging and writing on science and weather for the Houston Chronicle. And then when he left, he thought he really felt compelled to keep serving that audience that he had built up for several years. So he began this blog, launched spacecityweather.com. And his goal was to cut out what he called hype from all that weather forecasting, particularly during severe weather. And readership boomed during Harvey because here was a website that was focusing purely on the science, purely on the data, purely on the forecasting, not pictures of sobbing families hauling out cats and babies over their shoulders. It also wasn't on 24 hours a day. It updated periodically throughout the storm, but it wasn't focused on wall-to-wall coverage. And there are really several interesting things about how Space City Weather, this local independent weather blog, framed and focused the crisis. And afterward, my qualitative analysis looked at microassemblage and how different coverage ideas, how data were presented and portrayed on this website. And I'm going to share my screen. I've actually never done that on Teams. So I think it's a share tray, desktop window, entire screen. Sure, that's fine.
Sorry, Marcus, you're kind of on your own with this one. I think.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
I think you're getting it.
Okay, can y'all see the Space City Weather homepage here?
Yes, thanks. And I also put it into the chat if people want to look in there too. I put the link.
Awesome, thank you. So this is the homepage. This is the first thing that everybody saw, and this is from August 27th at 2:10 in the morning. This was in many ways the height of the storm. And I'm using this as an example because it emphasizes two things that are really important. First is a focus on data and on science in a really tangible, easy to understand sort of way. This is a graphic of the different bands that the Harvey basically stalled over and near Houston and kind of crawled to the northeast over nearly a week because of a high pressure system that was situated over central Texas. And the Space City Weather really explored that data and explored those ideas with a lot of graphics, with a lot of data. It considered and it discussed how different models were portraying this, what kind of rainfall totals we would be looking for. It also did so in a very frank and very personal way. A little down here, my wife, bless her, just asked me if band 3 was it for the night. I wanted nothing more to fall in her arms and say, yes, let's go to bed and forget this ever happened. But I'm sort of hopeful that it is. And this does two things. One, it keeps the focus, it keeps the central goal of the site on that data and on that science, but it also brings in a great deal of relatable personality. It focuses on individual experience and it focuses on an acknowledgement that the journalists are part of the storm. They're surviving just like everybody else without dipping into those survivor stories that, for lack of a better phrase, what we could call disaster porn that was playing on KHOU and all the local TV stations constantly 24 hours a day. There was also a real clear focus on comparing this to past hurricanes and past tropical storms. Names like Carla, Allison, Ike, Rita. These are names that we know pretty well in the Houston area because they all bring up real specific memories from real specific times and real specific storms. One of the other big things about the data was that uncertainty was openly embraced. What we find, at least in the United States, is that a lot of local journalists tend to, willfully or not, deliberately or not, imply a sort of rhetorical control and certainty over the weather. They have a real clear idea of where a storm is going to go. And of course, they don't. Meteorology is a complicated science. Space City Weather leaned into that. So this is from a little bit earlier, the big question, where will Harvey and its rains go? And it explored, and yes, Texas, Florida gets a lot of the credit, but we're up there too. It explored different prediction models, different meteorological data sets, and the likelihood and probability of the storm veering in one direction or another, and how the data, how those different meteorology models predicted different outcomes and how certain or how uncertain each individual was. There was no super projection of confidence. There was never an articulation that the storm is going to do this. Instead, there was a sense that, all right, the data from the European forecasting model suggests this, and here's why we think that's likely or unlikely, while these other data forecasting models from the National Weather Service or wherever it happens to be are suggesting other outcomes, and here's why we think that's unlikely or likely, or more often than not, why we don't exactly know and what we don't know about where the storm is going to go and how bad it's going to be. Clearly articulated likely and possible outcomes, often explaining that breadth of possibility in very scientific terms. The goal was to address the forecast with as much accuracy as possible while also acknowledging the uncertainty and unpredictability inherent to any forecast, let alone a record-breaking, terrifying rainfall event like Hurricane Harvey. And I can stop sharing here so y'all can see me again. On paper, that all sounds pretty dry, right? And pretty insider baseball, so to speak, something that weather nerds would enjoy, but that's really too dense or uncertain for the general public. And before the storm, that was more or less their audience. They definitely had a following. They definitely had people interested in their blog, interested in Houston weather, but it wasn't at all the same. Readership boomed exponentially once Hurricane Harvey started reaching Houston. And people responded really well to the clear articulation of the data and the discussions of uncertainty surrounding the storm. They also really responded well to the lack of disaster frames and survivor stories, and to the personalities and frankness of the site's authors. And that's a little bit counterintuitive from a research standpoint, because this is a strong example of local community building without that emotional disaster lost focus content. And part of the reason that TV journalism, local TV journalism in particular, defaults to those disaster frames is because there is sort of a mediated trauma, a shared experience. That the logic is that the safest and easiest way to build community and build camaraderie through a crisis is to focus on disasters, to focus on suffering and overcoming that disaster, powering through Houston strong, that some type of thing. And this is a really powerful counterexample of, no, this built a very loyal, devoted, interesting following while skipping all of that. Even when one of the author's homes flooded itself, it was acknowledged, but it wasn't dwelt on. There weren't really any disaster photos. There wasn't a focus on trauma. If anything, the only focus in that area was on overcoming, tips for dealing with flooding, tips for navigating severe weather, that sort of thing on a very practical basis. But no photos of suffering, very few photos of flooding, that sort of thing. It's an example of a community grounded in shared trauma, but also genuine scientific interest. And that's a message to all journalists, I think, not just science journalists even, but just generally, that uncertainty and transparency is really important, especially when dealing with complex scientific data. We don't need to default to emotion, to disaster, to loss, to build community and to build consensus during a crisis. On paper, conventional wisdom would argue that space city weather does not work during a crisis, that people will find it too dry, too dense, too distant. And that is not at all what we found. And that readership has maintained ever since. And it's seen booms whenever there's a tropical storm or a severe weather event, which in the Gulf Coast area happens with relative frequency. I also think this is a blueprint for discussing climate change with frankness and transparency without focusing on doom and gloom. That's something that Space City Weather really didn't address during or after Hurricane Harvey, even as the site was contextualizing the storm and how it compares to past severe weather and past hurricanes in the Houston area. There are, I think, a lot of understandable reasons for why a local weather blog would avoid the topic, especially in a conservative area like Texas. I think trolling and cyberbullying especially play a big part of that conversation. But I also feel strongly that as long as climate change remains a, quote, national or international issue, then it's going to feel foreign, it's going to feel distant, it's going to feel politicized for a lot of people. And I think tackling the science directly for a local audience with a hype-free focus could really start shifting public opinion. I think once climate change becomes a local conversation and a routine local conversation, I think people will start thinking about it differently. And Space City Weather isn't alone. There's a growing network of these local independent weather blogs like this all over the United States and likely Europe as well, because there's a genuine interest in scientific data and meteorology, and because this data is readily available. The authors here have a lot of expertise. They're certified meteorologists, but most of the data that they were using is accessible by the public. And I think that's part of the digital focus, and websites and social media and blogging. We all have access to all this data, but we don't all know what to do with it. We don't all know how to contextualize it and really understand it. And I think that in many ways, this is what the internet was designed to do, was to empower alternative and independent voices to really help us make sense of complexity. And I think Space City Weather does that well. And we can also see that, I'll just share this real quick. Again, so this was this morning, spectacular weekend ahead for Houston as we watch for a stormy start to next week. Same ideas, clear focus on the data, clear contextualization of the journalist within not just Houston, but within the weather events, and possible uncertainty, stormy start to next week, why the cold front might not be so harsh, why it might be stormy next week, that sort of thing. It embraces that uncertainty rather than implying certainty or precognition about the weather. Also, in terms of digital expansion, they have since Hurricane Harvey, they've developed a Spanish version, which I think is fantastic. There was a mention of demographic questions earlier. Houston has a very large Spanish-speaking population. The Spanish version is magnificent. They've also got an app that they launched, and I think they're still continuing to develop, which I think is also very cool.
Well, thanks, Marcus. That's great. And this funny enough, I got an email this week from a doctoral student and her advisor asking, are weather journalists or weather reporters or meteorologists considered journalists? And my colleague Christy Hess and I both emphatically responded, independent of each other, yes. And that there isn't enough work that's done on weather reporting. And so if anybody listening ever wants to do that, I think we have a few books out there. There's certainly a lot from issues of inequalities in who gets to report the journalism based on TV. For instance, I'm in Miami, and we can talk about specific body shapes and images and identifications and the gendering of sometimes the weather, what used to be the quote unquote weather girl, which Juliet, I think, can support me in this, that still, at least in some Spanish language, things exist, but that's not my culture or my area of expertise to comment on that. But certainly I think for outsiders who would come in, they would see something different. But in terms of the speculative nature of journalism and its authorities and legitimacies, I think that's really, really interesting. Juliet's going to have just a couple minutes of thoughts kind of on the special issue altogether. Just to give you a note before we're done, just one quick thing. Nadine was nice enough to put in the digital news report that focused on climate change. She links to that in the chat here for anybody who's interested in that. And then Lawrence also had posted something here that the work of Petrada et al. 2019 covers different demographics and their attitudes to interactivity. And there's a title of the piece, News Usage Patterns of Young Adults in the era of Interactive Journalism. So if anybody's interested in those questions from earlier before, that information has appeared in there. I do want to just take a few questions for Matthias, Philippe, and for Marcus or anybody else on the panel before we kind of hear some closing thoughts from Juliet. So if you have any thoughts or questions, I like the unmute thing, but I think Julia is also right to feel free to put those comments into the chat. I haven't been in a classroom in months or been teaching online for a long time, so I forgot the etiquette. So thank you for reminding me. Do the panelists have any questions for each other that we could just spend a couple minutes on before we go to Juliet, or should we have some comments from Juliet? What would you like? Nadine?
I have a question for Marcus. I found it very fascinating. Thank you for presenting this work. I was just skimming through the webpage, and I found that the style of writing is very, let's say it's kind of an easy writing, short sentences, and it's also kind of personalized. Do you have the feeling that this kind of writing and like connecting with the audience is one thing that it made really so attractive to so many people?
It's very bloggy, and it's very frank, and absolutely. And I think the local TV news, they were focusing on the disaster, they were focusing on the trauma, but it was also very polished. There's sort of a TV voice, there's a broadcaster voice, and I feel like there were some strong parasocial interaction effects going on here. I didn't focus on the comments or on the Twitter feeds specifically for this paper. It kept getting bigger and bigger. But I do know, reading the site regularly and following them on Twitter, that there is a great deal of direct interaction and direct conversation. And I think those two things play hand in hand with each other. There's a frankness, there's an openness, there's a sort of a self-deprecating sense of humor periodically, and especially during Harvey, which was the worst storm that most of us had lived through. There was sort of a grim acknowledgement and some dark humor from time to time that played well with that. So I think part of it is the writing style, part of it is the frankness and the directness, and part of it is a willingness to directly communicate with people on social media and in comment sections. There was maybe a little bit less of that during Harvey, just because it was such a big crisis. But I know I've emailed, I have some friends of mine from Honduras, and there was a hurricane coming through at one point, and I emailed them and I said, hey, what can you, how bad is this going to get? And they emailed right back and said, yeah, it's going to be pretty bad. And there was a sense of direct connection and frankness there that I think is very telling, and I think empowering for a lot of journalists on a lot of subjects. And I know with respect to climate change in particular, sounding or feeling elite or pompous or unapproachable will not help journalists or scientists or academics really communicate climate science. We have to feel approachable. We have to seem like human beings, and I think this is a good example of that.
I have a question for Matthias. I found your discussion of the intermediate agenda setting really interesting, and I'm wondering if you saw any bleed over from what La Nación is doing with Naturaleza to like Clarín or Página 12 or other outlets in Buenos Aires or in La Provincia.
Yes, they are way ahead of their competitors. So yeah, definitely they were the first ones to invest on this environmental data journalism, this kind of niche of data journalism. And what I saw in these last years is that Clarín is trying to invest more on data journalism. But of course, that they're struggling a lot with, like these financial issues that newsrooms are having. But yeah, definitely they have, I think La Nación had this mindset of being like innovative adoption of technology. So that's what made them very different. And they are known as like a powerhouse, data powerhouse in Latin America. That's the reason, because they are way ahead the other ones. I think that's what makes the difference. But yeah, the other ones are not that developed. But on the other side, we have, for example, fact-checking news agents like Chequeado, that are really adopting new technologies there and using a lot of, like data-driven stories. They adopt AI in their process of fact-checking and identify the rumors or the fake news stories. So yeah, so it's something that we see that there is one big player that is traditional media, but there are other small news outlets that are doing some innovation in the news industry there.
I think I put La Nación in the chat here. So I'm sorry if I forgot to do that before when we were talking about your paper. So if that's not correct, please, Juliet or Matthias.
It is.
Okay, great, thanks. My wife's Colombian, and I tried through osmosis, but sometimes I struggle a little bit. Victoria has a question for Marcus. It says, very interesting. Do you have any information about the socio-demographic, socioeconomic background of the readers? And I put above Victoria's question for the last podcast, one of the previous podcasts that we put out that you were a part of, and we talked a little bit about the inequalities and notions of class in terms of alternative news and how this blog kind of fit into some of those discussions of alternative news. And I remember even asking the question of, well, were these people seem to be talking a lot about homeowners. And I said, well, what about renters, right? What about not just moving into the polar opposite, which are people experiencing homelessness? That's important, but that seems to be a little bit disingenuous sometimes when journalists go to that route. But I think this question is really good. So again, it's what information might you have about socio-demographic and socioeconomic backgrounds of the readers for Victoria?
I think especially during Harvey, the typical audience for Space City Weather was probably the same as your typical blogging audience generally. It's probably mostly Caucasian. It's probably mostly at least high school educated, maybe a little bit more educated than the average. I don't know about their audiences sort of generally now. I would assume that their audience generally is more diverse than most, just because Houston, by some metrics, is the most diverse city in the country per capita. By any metric, it's top 5. I know that they're really expanding and trying to focus on Spanish language content, and much of that, there's a tab of it on the website, but they're also really pushing social media content for the Spanish version. And I think that's in part to reach Spanish speaking audiences on Facebook and Twitter, assuming that they might be less likely to click on a blog or follow a blog, and trying to be more accessible to where the audience is. And that's something that a lot of people in Houston are trying to do, because we do have a large Spanish-speaking population that historically has been very underserved. But at the same time, would I assume that most of the people who have downloaded the app, look like me? Yeah, probably. I would assume that. I don't know for sure, but I would say it's probably more diverse than most weather blogs like it, just by virtue of being here and by virtue of them making such an effort to reach out to Spanish-speaking populations.
Well, thanks. I do want to end this in a few minutes so that we keep within time. But I want to say thanks, Matthias. Matthias put in another link for people who are following along. So please take a look at that. And one of the things I think was a real outcome for me from the special issue was really this notion of synergistic effects. And we talk about this in 2 episodes of the podcast. Can you tell what I do with a lot of my research time? But what we mean by that is that I think that the special issue really showed how there are multiple dimensions to how journalists have to deal with climate change and its own effects. And so climate change, and at the same time there's flooding, there's heat. At the same time there's massive redevelopment and forced migration from parts of the world to build some sort of quote unquote sustainable living. There's also forced migration of other folks who are in a legal term refugees, and that's part of one of our discussions, 2 of an upcoming podcast, is the term refugee and some of its problems, but also its legalistic terminology. But certainly we have people who are moving for very different reasons and being forced to move. And journalists have to figure out, not just how to cover that science, but some of those social inequalities and the issues in that. But so that was kind of one of my takeaways that we write about a little bit in the introduction. But Juliet, what did you think from the several conversations that we've had? Man, we've really milked this special issue a lot. Our goal is to get this out to people and to get the articles free or open access, and to make this as public as possible so people really can engage with scholarship in ways that maybe they haven't as much. But Julia, what are your thoughts from today's conversation?
Well, first, I just want to thank you, Ted, for putting this all together and all the events that you're doing, the podcast and everything. It's just been such a pleasure, as always, to work with you on this project. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this panel. It was really interesting, and many thanks to our presenters, not just for taking the time to talk with us today, but their interest in our special issue. And as you mentioned, Ted, for this volume, we were really interested in unpacking the complexities involved with communicating about these synergistic effects of climate change. As we wrote, those independent but related aspects of climate change that are often treated separately or discussed as separate entities, but when considered, but that can operate in unison and form even greater challenges for society when we take the entire milieu of socio-cultural, political, economic, all of those contexts. And with wicked problems such as climate change, it's particularly important to explore these intersections of data science, journalism, and the societies within which they operate. When journalism professionals have been tasked with the translation and explanation of the complexities of climate change, they are faced with daunting tasks: deconstructing science, determining expert legitimacy, accurately explaining causality, all the while operating, for the most part, in a relentless market-oriented environment with fragmented audiences whose attention has become the most important commodity in today's market digital economies. Or in the context of political and economic instability. As Silvio Weisbord noted, some media ecologies are caught between the rock of the state and the hard place of the market. So the studies presented here in this double issue help us understand those intersections, whether we're talking about covering record-breaking wildfires in Europe, where journalists who see themselves as educators are focused on drawing that line from extreme weather events to climate change for their audiences, or to interactive immersive journalism that is designed to enhance climate literacy and combat misinformation, two extremely important challenges in the digital information age, by changing viewers into active participants who become engaged with the story. We've learned about environmental data journalism, a long-term strategy from an award-winning newsroom in Buenos Aires that is data-centric and collaborative in its approach to environmental journalism, while also meeting the social and institutional needs and pressures of advertising by branding the news as environmental. And from wildfires to extreme storms and flooding, breaking through the disaster-centric emotional coverage, an independent blog in Houston founded by former local journalists provided crucial information to audiences desperately in need of a break from the unending hype, giving them science, data, and forecasting without diminishing the scientific uncertainty. This also included providing first-person narrative, humor, transparency, and historical context. This is fundamental, as Marcus noted, to building community resiliency and activating individual agency, and it provides a counter-narrative to the tendency to dwell on the mediated trauma. Together, these studies represent important critical and cross-cultural perspectives on the synergistic effects of climate change through crises, seemingly unending cycles of crises, and social inequalities, interpretations, and explanations. How can mediated arenas better engage and educate and inspire audiences as we scale from the local to the global? They all talked about hybrid and new forms of journalistic output and practice that can help us understand these issues more comprehensively in an age of accelerating climate change and synergistic effects. Here we see the pressures of journalists working across the globe who have to respond to these multifaceted challenges, making these intersections of data engagement and the environment, while also finding ways to interpret and communicate climate change effects. As journalists are faced with covering extreme weather events, complex issues such as biodiversity loss, they are utilizing new tools and developing new collaborations. These are crucial avenues that we as scholars and educators must explore. Communicators are developing innovative interactive storytelling tools to reach audiences where they are and have real impact. So Ted and I are encouraged not just by the excellent submissions we receive, but also by the sheer scale of the interest in communicating about climate change and synergistic effects in the age of the Anthropocene, particularly in terms of the interdisciplinary international collaborations that bring together scholars, educators, and practitioners from across academic silos and professional orientations. We very much look forward to continuing this work and to help us better understand the societies in which we live and educate tomorrow's communicators, professionals, and scholars. So thanks very much to all of you again. It's been a pleasure to work with you on this issue.
Well, and thanks so much for everybody joining today. I'm just putting my email address in here, so if anybody has any questions or concerns about today's talk, feel free to send me a note. Certainly, I've been tweeting about your talks, and so you can follow at Journ Practice on Twitter. And we'll be releasing another podcast about the special issue and responding to Randy's question, will this be available for people who might not have been able to come earlier on in the talk, where we had some previous speakers? Yes, I'll do my best to try and put this video together over the weekend, and we'll be tweeting that out next week. So if I can ask all of the guest presenters to just hang on for a few minutes after we end, so I can just check your temperature and see how everybody's doing. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and I hope that this is just one of many more future collaborations between people to make our scholarship public and put it into a framework so that it is much more interesting than sometimes the articles on their own can be. Certainly discussion allows us to do that. So thank you, everybody, so much. And if I can ask the guests to just hang on, then I can just make sure everybody's okay from our conversation. Thank you, all of our guests, for joining us.